Snow pressed softly against the evidence tape as the flashlight beam stopped moving. Beneath the frozen reeds, something pale broke the shoreline pattern, unmoving, deliberate in its stillness, waiting to be catalogued. The responding officer paused, breath visible, aware that this moment would not end when the night did. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. In December of 1993, the Hudson Valley carried its winter quietly. Holiday lights hung from porches along two-lane roads, and local newspapers were already printing Thanksgiving retrospectives as the year leaned toward Christmas. It was in this seasonal stillness that 22-year-old Laura Whitman became a name that would not fade. Laura lived in Poughkeepsie, New York, a city shaped by rail lines, river fog, and aging brick apartments built for workers long gone. She worked part-time at a bookstore near Main Street and shared a modest second-floor apartment with a roommate who had gone home for the holidays. Laura was described in missing person flyers as 5'6", brown hair, last seen wearing a winter coat and scarf. The flyers would eventually yellow in file cabinets and corkboards, but they began as urgent rectangles of hope. On December 17, Laura did not show up for her afternoon shift. By evening, coworkers called her apartment and reached no answer. Her car, a blue sedan, was not in its usual street spot. Family members initially assumed holiday travel or a spontaneous visit with friends. By the following morning, the absence hardened into concern. A missing person report was filed with the Poughkeepsie Police Department. Officers followed standard procedure, noting no immediate signs of foul play. Laura was an adult, legally free to travel. Still, the date and the weather were noted carefully. Snowfall was forecast and temperatures were dropping below freezing. 3 days later, a county parks employee walking a service path near the Hudson River shoreline noticed something inconsistent with driftwood patterns. The location was a marshy inlet not far from a disused boat launch, an area frequented by fishermen in warmer months and avoided in winter. Responding officers secured the scene before dawn. The body was identified later that day as Laura Whitman. There were no signs of struggle visible at the scene, no obvious wounds. Her coat was zipped. Her scarf was intact. The calmness of the scene unsettled even seasoned investigators. The autopsy conducted at the Dutchess County Medical Examiner's office revealed subtle but critical details. Cause of death was ruled as asphyxiation, consistent with manual pressure. There were no defensive injuries. Time of death was estimated between the evening of December 17 and early morning December 18. Toxicology returned negative. The lack of external trauma complicated the narrative. This was not a crime of chaos. It was controlled, deliberate, and quiet. The file was assigned a homicide designation and entered into state and federal databases. Investigators reconstructed Laura's final known movements. Bank records showed no activity after December 17. Her car was located 2 weeks later in a municipal lot near the Poughkeepsie train station. There were no fingerprints of value recovered at the time, and surveillance coverage in 1993 was limited and grainy. Witness canvassing produced little. A clerk remembered Laura buying coffee that afternoon. A neighbor recalled hearing footsteps on the stairs that evening, but nothing unusual. Winter had a way of muting sound and memory. The case gained brief local media attention. Headlines appeared between holiday advertisements and end-of-year summaries. Laura's photograph was printed beside words like unanswered and ongoing. Then January arrived and attention shifted. Detectives continued working the case, but leads thinned. A former boyfriend was interviewed and cleared. Coworkers were questioned. The riverfront area was searched again in spring, yielding nothing new. By the summer of 1994, the file was marked cold, not forgotten but waiting. Years passed. The police department moved buildings. Files were boxed and reboxed. Evidence bags were relabeled to meet evolving standards. Laura's case sat among dozens of unsolved homicides from an era before digital certainty. Her parents aged. Her name surfaced occasionally during anniversary articles or holiday reflections on unsolved crimes. Each December, a detective would pull the file and review it again, tracing timelines, rereading statements, hopping for something overlooked. In 2009, a state-funded cold case initiative brought renewed attention to unsolved homicides from the early 1990s. Advances in DNA testing offered possibilities unavailable in Laura's time. The evidence inventory was reviewed. Among the preserved items was Laura's scarf. At the time of collection, it had been logged but not tested beyond basic fiber examination. Modern analysis revealed trace DNA not belonging to Laura. The sample was partial but viable. The profile was entered into CODIS. No immediate match returned. Investigators did not stop there. They expanded the search to familial DNA databases as protocols evolved. In 2018, a partial familial association emerged, pointing toward a family line in Ulster County. This was not an identification but a direction. Detectives began building a quiet, methodical tree, reviewing males of appropriate age in 1993 with proximity to Poughkeepsie. One name surfaced repeatedly in peripheral records. Michael R. Keller, then 28, lived in Kingston in 1993 and worked seasonal maintenance jobs along the Hudson River. He had no violent convictions but several minor arrests for trespassing and disorderly conduct. In 1993, he had been questioned briefly in an unrelated incident near the Poughkeepsie train station. At the time, nothing connected him to Laura Whitman. Investigators obtained a discarded DNA sample from Keller in 2021 through lawful means. The comparison was conclusive. The profile matched the DNA recovered from Laura's scarf. The probability statistics were overwhelming. A warrant was issued. Keller was arrested quietly in his home in early December, nearly 28 years after Laura's death. The arrest shocked the community. Local papers ran restrained headlines, emphasizing resolution rather than spectacle. Keller was charged with second-degree murder. During interrogation, he did not confess, but the evidence was sufficient. Additional circumstantial links were established. Employment records placed him near Poughkeepsie on December 17, 1993. Witness re-interviews confirmed seeing a man matching his description near the train station that night. In 2023, Keller pleaded guilty as part of a negotiated agreement sparing Laura's family a trial. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. In court, there were no outbursts. The room was quiet. Laura's photograph rested on a table, unchanged by time. After the sentencing, the case file was closed. Detectives returned it to the archive, now marked solved. Outside, snow fell again on the Hudson Valley. Holiday lights reflected in courthouse windows. Laura Whitman's name was spoken one last time in an official capacity, then released back into memory, where it had waited patiently for justice to catch up. By the winter of 1994, Laura Whitman's name had begun to settle into the background of public consciousness, not through indifference, but through the slow erosion that time brings to unresolved loss. Investigators continued their work with procedural discipline, documenting every follow-up, every negative result, every interview that led nowhere. The Hudson Valley moved through seasons, from ice to thaw, from humid summers to falling leaves, while the case remained suspended in a single December week. Detective reports from early 1994 show an emphasis on reconstruction rather than speculation. Officers retraced Laura's final day repeatedly, noting the ordinary nature of her routine. She had eaten breakfast at home, paid a utility bill in person, and spoken briefly with her mother on the phone about holiday plans. There were no signs of distress in her voice, no mention of meeting anyone that evening. This ordinariness was documented carefully, because in homicide investigations, deviation from routine often marks the point of intervention. Attention turned to the area surrounding the Poughkeepsie train station. In the early 1990s, it was a transitional zone, neither fully derelict nor entirely revitalized. Maintenance workers, commuters, and transient populations overlapped there, particularly in winter when shelters filled quickly. Detectives reviewed police logs from that week, looking for disturbances, complaints, or arrests that might intersect with Laura's timeline. Several names were noted, then crossed out, then noted again as investigators searched for patterns that refused to form. The recovered car provided little clarity. It had been parked legally, with no signs of forced entry. The interior was clean, offering no trace evidence beyond Laura's own. The keys were not recovered, suggesting she had not intended to abandon the vehicle. This detail shaped the working theory for years. Investigators believed Laura encountered someone she recognized, or at least did not fear, someone who did not provoke resistance or alarm. In the spring of 1995, detectives revisited the riverfront area with fresh eyes. Water levels had receded, and vegetation had changed. A second search produced fragments of clothing fibers that were later determined to be environmentally transferred and unrelated. The absence of physical evidence reinforced the impression of a controlled act, one that left little behind and exploited the isolation of winter terrain. The case endured personnel changes. Original investigators retired or transferred. New detectives inherited the file, bringing updated training and perspectives. Each new review began with the same summary, the same autopsy findings, the same unanswered questions. The file grew thicker, not with solutions but with documentation of effort. In law enforcement culture, this mattered. A case that showed continuous attention was less likely to be forgotten entirely. Laura's family maintained contact with the department, though the calls grew less frequent. Each December, her mother sent a handwritten card to the station, thanking whoever was assigned for remembering. Those cards were placed in the file. They were not evidence, but they became part of the record, quiet reminders of obligation. By the early 2000s, forensic science had advanced, but not all advances could be retroactively applied. The scarf remained preserved, sealed according to protocols that had already evolved twice since 1993. It was tested again in 2004 with limited results. The DNA sample was too small, too degraded for the methods available at the time. The report was filed, marked inconclusive, and the scarf returned to storage. Media attention resurfaced briefly in 2008 when a local paper ran a series on unsolved cases. Laura's photograph appeared again, now dated by hairstyle and clothing. The article emphasized her age, 22, and the passage of 15 years. It quoted no speculation, only confirmed facts. That restraint reflected the tone of the community, one that preferred quiet remembrance to sensational revival. The turning point came not through a tip but through policy. New York State allocated funds specifically for the re-examination of cold cases involving preserved biological evidence. The directive required agencies to inventory and reassess items previously deemed unsuitable for testing. Laura Whitman's scarf was flagged once more, not because it promised answers, but because it met the criteria. In 2016, the scarf was sent to a specialized laboratory. Analysts worked slowly, aware of the evidence's age and fragility. When a partial profile emerged, it was treated cautiously. Partial profiles can mislead as easily as they can guide. Still, the data was entered and investigators waited. Months passed with no match, but the absence of a hit did not end the inquiry. Detectives began studying Laura's social environment with renewed focus. They reviewed employment rosters from businesses near the train station in 1993, many of which no longer existed. Paper records were tracked down in basements, storage units, and municipal archives. Names were digitized, ages calculated, addresses plotted on maps that no longer resembled the neighborhoods they once represented. Michael R. Keller's name appeared first as a footnote. He had worked short-term maintenance contracts along the river, including snow removal near public access points. His proximity was geographic, not personal. Still, detectives noted it. When familial DNA techniques became available, Keller's extended family surfaced as a statistical possibility. The lead was treated with caution, following legal guidelines designed to prevent overreach. Surveillance was minimal and lawful. Keller was observed going about his life, older now, quieter, with no outward signs of criminality. Investigators focused instead on corroboration. Employment records confirmed his presence in Poughkeepsie during the relevant week. Old citations placed him near the train station late at night. None of this proved guilt, but together they formed a pattern worth testing. The discarded DNA sample confirmed what years of work had only suggested. The match was strong, defensible, and supported by probability calculations that left little room for doubt. Supervisors reviewed the findings. Prosecutors were consulted. The decision to arrest was not rushed. In cold cases, restraint is as important as persistence. When Keller was taken into custody, it was without spectacle. The arrest occurred in early December, a deliberate choice made by circumstance rather than symbolism. Snow lined the streets again, as it had in 1993. News traveled quickly through Poughkeepsie and Kingston, carried by local radio and evening papers. The tone was measured, reflecting relief more than outrage. As the case moved toward resolution, investigators prepared for scrutiny. Every step taken over 3 decades was reviewed, every report re-examined. The goal was not only conviction but clarity. Laura Whitman's case had waited long enough. The legal process unfolded with a deliberate pace, shaped by the age of the evidence and the weight of history. Prosecutors assembled a narrative that relied not on dramatic revelation, but on accumulation, the slow stacking of verified facts until the outline of responsibility became unavoidable. Every document from 1993 was scanned, indexed, and compared against modern standards. Chain of custody logs were reviewed line by line to ensure continuity from the frozen shoreline to the present courtroom. The defense focused initially on time. Decades, they argued, erode certainty. Memories fade, witnesses die, environments change. Prosecutors acknowledged this reality without conceding its implications. They emphasized that physical evidence does not age in the same way recollection does, and that the scarf, preserved through multiple protocol updates, represented a direct link between victim and offender that had never been broken. Investigators revisited Laura Whitman's final evening with forensic neutrality. Weather records confirmed snowfall beginning shortly after dusk on December 17. Transit schedules showed the last northbound train departing before midnight. The timeline suggested Laura encountered Keller near the station after returning to her car, likely during a moment that appeared routine and safe. There was no indication of prolonged restraint or transportation beyond the immediate area. The autopsy findings, once considered limited, took on renewed significance. The absence of defensive injuries aligned with a scenario involving trust or sudden incapacitation. The medical examiner's original notes, handwritten and precise, were entered into evidence. They described pressure patterns consistent with close contact, not a struggle. These details reinforced the prosecution's theory of a brief, controlled encounter. Witness statements from the early 1990s were introduced carefully, not as definitive accounts but as contextual markers. A transit worker recalled seeing a maintenance vehicle idling near the station late that night. A fisherman remembered tire tracks near the river access road the following morning, partly obscured by snow. At the time, these observations meant little. In retrospect, they fit within the established window. Keller's movements after 1993 were also examined. He left the area within a year, taking work in other counties. There were no further violent offenses attributed to him, a fact that complicated public perception. Prosecutors addressed this by emphasizing that absence of repetition does not negate occurrence. Some acts are singular, shaped by circumstance rather than pattern. As the case approached trial readiness, Laura's family was briefed regularly. They were older now, their expectations tempered by years of uncertainty. They asked few questions, seeking not explanation but confirmation. When prosecutors explained the DNA evidence and its statistical strength, the family requested only that the process remain respectful and factual. The plea agreement emerged after months of negotiation. Keller agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for the dismissal of lesser ancillary charges and the avoidance of trial. The agreement required a full allocution, acknowledging responsibility without narrative embellishment. Prosecutors accepted, citing the interests of justice and the emotional toll a trial would impose on aging witnesses and family members. The courtroom on sentencing day was sparsely filled. There were no cameras inside, no raised voices. Keller stood, older and diminished, as the charges were read. He spoke briefly, acknowledging his actions without elaboration. The judge referenced the length of time between offense and accountability, noting that delay does not reduce harm. The sentence, 25 years to life, reflected statutory guidelines and the seriousness of the crime. Afterward, Laura Whitman's name appeared once more in local headlines, this time followed by the word resolved. Editorials emphasized the persistence of investigators and the role of advancing science. There was no attempt to mythologize the case. It was presented as what it was, a quiet crime answered by quiet work. In the weeks following sentencing, detectives closed remaining administrative tasks. Evidence was cataloged for long-term retention. Digital records were finalized. The physical file, now thick with addenda, was returned to the archive with a new classification. A small notation marked the date of resolution. The Hudson Valley entered another winter. Snow fell on familiar roads, covering paths that had been walked for decades. The river moved steadily past the place where Laura had been found, indifferent to memory. In the police department, a bulletin board was updated, one less photograph pinned among the unsolved. The absence was noted, then accepted. Laura Whitman's life did not expand in retrospect. Investigators resisted the urge to define her by her death. Records described her as a daughter, an employee, a resident. Ordinary descriptors, intentionally preserved. Closure in this context meant accuracy rather than consolation. For the community, the case served as a reminder of continuity. Crimes do not vanish when attention shifts. They wait, embedded in paperwork and preserved fabric until conditions allow them to speak again. In 1993, winter concealed answers. In later years, patience revealed them. The aftermath was quiet. No further charges were filed. No civil actions followed. Laura's family visited the river once, standing at a distance, observing without ceremony. They returned home as they had so many times before, carrying a resolution that did not erase loss but framed it within truth. In the end, the case closed not with revelation but with confirmation. A young woman's life ended in a season defined by reflection and ritual. Decades later, the record caught up. The system, imperfect and slow, delivered an answer that had waited through many winters to be heard. The months following the sentencing were marked by administrative silence, the kind that follows long-running investigations when the final paperwork replaces fieldwork. Detectives who had spent years revisiting Laura Whitman's file returned to other cases, carrying with them the procedural lessons reinforced by her resolution. Supervisors used the case in internal reviews, not as a triumph, but as an example of continuity across generations of investigators. In early 2024, the department conducted a formal audit of its remaining cold cases from the late 20th century. Laura's file, now complete, was referenced as evidence that preservation mattered. The scarf, once considered nearly useless, became a teaching point. It illustrated how restraint in evidence handling could allow future science to succeed where past methods could not. Younger officers, many born after 1993, studied the reports as historical documents rather than lived memory. The courthouse in Poughkeepsie returned to its routine. The courtroom where Keller had been sentenced hosted tax disputes, contract hearings, and procedural motions. Laura's case no longer occupied a physical space there, only a citation in appellate records. No appeal was filed. Keller was transferred to a state correctional facility upstate, his intake date recorded, his classification assigned. The system absorbed him without comment. Local media attention diminished quickly. Follow-up articles focused on the broader implications of forensic genealogy rather than the specifics of Laura's death. Her name appeared less frequently, replaced by generalized language about justice delayed and resolved. This shift was intentional. Editors chose not to revisit details unnecessarily, respecting both family and community fatigue. For Laura's parents, the resolution altered daily rhythms in subtle ways. They no longer anticipated December phone calls from detectives. They no longer checked the mail for updates. The annual uncertainty that had accompanied the holidays for 3 decades eased into a different form of remembrance. They spoke of Laura more freely, without the weight of unanswered questions pressing against every recollection. The apartment where Laura once lived had changed hands many times. New tenants were unaware of its history. The building itself showed signs of renovation, updated windows, and a repainted stairwell. The street outside was busier now, lined with newer vehicles and brighter lighting. The past existed there only in records and memory, not in physical markers. Investigators reflected privately on the nature of single-offense offenders. Keller did not fit popular narratives of serial violence. His life after 1993 appeared unremarkable, shaped by labor and transience. Psychologists consulted by the prosecution suggested situational factors, stressors that converged briefly and never repeated. These assessments were filed but not emphasized publicly. Explanation was not the same as justification, and the justice system required none. The Hudson River continued its seasonal cycle, freezing at the edges and thawing again. The inlet where Laura was found remained undeveloped, its isolation preserved by geography rather than intention. No memorial was placed there. Authorities discouraged it, citing environmental protection and safety. The absence of a marker aligned with the family's wishes. They preferred memory without spectacle. In departmental training sessions, Laura Whitman's case was referenced alongside others solved through delayed DNA analysis. Instructors highlighted the importance of revisiting assumptions. Early investigators had believed the offender was someone within Laura's immediate social circle. That assumption had guided interviews and resource allocation. Later analysis revealed the danger of narrowing focus too soon. This lesson was recorded, repeated, and institutionalized. The quiet aftermath extended beyond law enforcement. Community members who remembered Laura in 1993 spoke of the arrest with subdued acknowledgement rather than renewed grief. Time had layered their memories with other events, other losses. The resolution was absorbed into local history, a footnote corrected after decades of uncertainty. Court records show no public statements from Keller after sentencing. He did not seek media attention or publish explanations. His silence was consistent with his demeanor throughout proceedings. The absence of narrative left investigators with facts alone, an outcome that aligned with the documentary nature of the case. As the year progressed, holiday decorations returned to Poughkeepsie streets. Storefronts displayed lights and wreaths. Snow forecasts appeared in local papers. For the first time in many years, Laura Whitman's name did not accompany seasonal crime retrospectives. Editors chose newer cases, leaving hers to rest. The final administrative act occurred when the state officially reclassified Laura's homicide as cleared by arrest. The statistical change was minor, a single line in annual reports. Yet within that line existed 30 years of waiting, preservation, and incremental progress. Numbers rarely convey such weight, but investigators understood it. In retirement interviews, one of the original detectives spoke briefly about the case. He recalled the morning Laura was found, the stillness of the shoreline, the uncertainty that followed. He expressed satisfaction not in the arrest, but in the confirmation that the work had not been wasted. His remarks were measured, devoid of sentimentality. Laura Whitman's story concluded not with revelation, but with alignment. Evidence, science, and procedure eventually converged. The delay did not alter the truth, only the time required to reach it. In the landscape of American cold cases, hers became one of the many that demonstrate how patience can outlast obscurity. The system moved on as it always does. Files closed, personnel shifted, seasons turned. What remained was a complete record, preserved for reference rather than pursuit. Laura's name stayed within it, fixed at 22, no longer followed by the word unsolved, no longer waiting for winter to pass. The closing of Laura Whitman's case did not produce a public reckoning or a dramatic shift in how the community understood itself. Instead, it settled into the quieter register of administrative completion and personal adjustment. Law enforcement agencies filed final reports with the state, noting the date of clearance and the method by which it was achieved. The language was restrained, technical, and precise, reflecting a preference for accuracy over narrative flourish. In the months that followed, the evidence locker inventory was reviewed once more. Items associated with the case were labeled for long-term retention under homicide protocols. The scarf, now central to the resolution, was sealed and stored in climate-controlled conditions. Its role had changed from unanswered question to confirmed link, but its handling remained the same. Preservation, not symbolism, governed the process. The prosecutorial file was archived, its digital copies backed up across redundant systems. Transcripts, lab reports, and affidavits were indexed for future reference. The case became part of training curricula, cited in seminars on cold case management and forensic patience. It was never used as an example of investigative brilliance, but rather of institutional memory and procedural continuity. For the Whitman family, the legal outcome introduced a new form of quiet. There were no longer pending court dates or investigative updates. Their involvement with the justice system ended not with celebration but with acknowledgement. They declined interviews and public statements, choosing privacy over visibility. Their decision was respected, and media outlets complied. In private, the family revisited personal artifacts. Photographs were reorganized. Letters were reread. The absence of uncertainty allowed memory to exist without interruption. Laura's life, once overshadowed by the circumstances of her death, regained its earlier contours. Conversations about her included humor and detail, not speculation or silence. The community's response reflected its demographic composition. Older residents, many of whom remembered the original headlines, spoke of the case as a reminder of how time alters perspective. Younger residents encountered it as a historical footnote, an example of how crimes from before their adulthood could still reach resolution. The generational divide did not diminish the shared understanding that the outcome mattered. Seasonal rhythms continued. Thanksgiving passed with its familiar rituals. Christmas lights returned to Main Street. New Year's Eve arrived without reference to the case. The absence of annual reminders marked a subtle shift. Laura Whitman's name was no longer attached to unsolved lists or anniversary features. That silence carried its own meaning. Within the police department, detectives rotated assignments. Some who had worked the case retired, carrying with them the knowledge that persistence had been rewarded, even if belatedly. Others moved on to new investigations, applying the same procedural discipline reinforced by Laura's resolution. The case influenced practice more than policy, shaping attitudes rather than rules. The Hudson Valley itself remained unchanged in its physical features. The river continued to define the landscape, its banks alternating between development and neglect. The inlet where Laura was found remained quiet, visited only by wildlife and the occasional passerby. No marker indicated its history. The lack of physical commemoration aligned with the family's wishes and the community's temperament. Michael Keller entered the correctional system without distinction. His intake records noted age, health, and sentence. He was assigned housing according to standard criteria. There were no special conditions attached to his incarceration. The system treated him as it treats all convicted offenders, uniformly and without comment. Psychological assessments conducted during intake reiterated earlier conclusions. The offense was categorized as situational, not compulsive. These findings were documented but did not alter sentencing or classification. The justice system's role ended with confinement, not interpretation. Over time, references to the case diminished further. Annual crime reports listed it among those cleared, a statistic rather than a story. Academic articles cited it as an example of delayed forensic success. Each reference stripped away narrative detail, leaving only function and outcome. For those who had known Laura personally, the resolution did not erase grief, but it reshaped it. Loss no longer existed alongside unanswered questions. The certainty of accountability allowed mourning to proceed without interruption. This change was gradual, almost imperceptible, but its effects were lasting. The passage of years had altered the city that once searched for Laura. Infrastructure improved. Lighting increased. Surveillance technology expanded. The environment in which the crime occurred no longer existed in the same form. Investigators noted this evolution in training sessions, emphasizing how context shapes opportunity and how prevention often follows tragedy. Laura Whitman's case became part of a broader narrative about time and justice. It demonstrated that resolution does not require immediacy to retain meaning. The delay did not diminish the value of the outcome, though it underscored the cost of waiting. This balance was acknowledged without judgment. As winter returned again to the Hudson Valley, snow covered roads and riverbanks with familiar consistency. The season that once framed uncertainty now passed without it. The calendar no longer carried Laura's case forward year after year. Its movement stopped, fixed in record rather than expectation. In the end, the story concluded without spectacle. A young woman's life ended in December 1993. A lawful investigation continued across decades. Science advanced. Evidence endured. Accountability arrived. The system closed the file and the community adjusted quietly. What remained was not a legend or a cautionary tale, but a complete account preserved accurately, allowed finally to rest.